Not 5 years in here, but 5 years historically. But I tell you what, God calls him back, doesn't he? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't know that God didn't use him somewhere else. But in this King James Bible, he's off the scene here for about 5 or 6 years. He comes back. You see, sometimes God does put people on a shelf and just lets them sit for whatever reason, and then God will bring them right back. Aren't you glad of that? Lord knows I'm glad of that. Sometimes I've been on the shelf. God says, y'all know what I'm talking about. But we see here, when God says that's enough, down in the vineyard, he calls, all of a sudden, he says, Elijah, I need you to go down to that vineyard. He calls him, and Elijah goes and meets him in Naboth's vineyard. And he says, are you my enemy? And he tells him, you're going to die, and your whole family's going to die. And the dogs are going to eat your carcasses. And your wife. I believe she's going to fall out a window, isn't she? Probably that same window that she looked out and saw all this stuff going on. You see? I'm getting way ahead now. But anyhow, what we see here is that when God says that's enough, well, number one, God's mission is declared. When he sends Elijah, God's mission is declared. Let's look at it. There is some comfort there. It's twofold. God has grace in the situation. You see, Elijah thought that he had served the Lord maybe for the last time. I don't know that, but I can only imagine. He hadn't been used here in the Bible that we can see for 5 or 6 years. So we have some grace there. And now we see that he's being used. And then you see, then there's the grace of the situation that brings him back, and then God's grasp of the situation. See, God's words to the prophet let him know that the Lord is on top of the situation, to let him know that where Ahab stood. He says, but I'm going to use you, Elijah. I'm going to use you. You see? Then we see here the cause of it. The reason God sends Elijah with the message of death and destruction is because of the events that occurred in verses 1 through 16 about the vineyard. And in these verses, Ahab and Jezebel have committed those horrible sins we've talked about. They perverted the law of God, made fun of God, and put an innocent man to death, made people lie to bear false witness. You see, they've taken the belongings and things that are now of a dead man. He's down there collecting. I bet that before the man's body even got cold dead in the ground, Ahab was down there snooping around all in the vineyard, probably all through the house, moving all the stuff out, getting ready to make whatever he's going to do with the herbs. You see? But see, God sees the cause of it. God sees the content of it. He does. God's message is direct and plain. There ain't no misunderstanding, folks. That's about 4th or 5th grade language right there. You're going to be put to death. The dogs are going to be licking you once you're dead. And that's it. And if you're in a field and die, your family, then the fowls of the air are going to get them. How plain is that? That's 3rd, 4th grade English right there. So the content is easy to understand. Then we see the sin. God knew what Ahab had done. He knew the extent of it. He knew the violence of it. Nothing got by God. Nothing gets by God. You see, everything is open to God. He sees it all. We imagine, I was listening to a Sunday school on the radio, coming to Sunday school, and the guy was talking about the vantage point of different places. Our vantage point is that this world is big and that the universe is huge, because that's our vantage point. Because all we can see are the 9 or 10 planets, because sometimes they said they found another one, I reckon. I don't know, is it Pluto Ed or Pluto U? I don't know what the latest planet is, but we have 9 or 10 or something. But anyhow, that's all we know. For all we know, there could be a much more vast area. You see? So God's vantage point is much larger than ours. We can't even put it into reality, all of it. Because we live on this planet Earth that we think is so large, but in the scope of everything, even with our little universe, it seems big, but it's really not. But plain English. So we see the sin which is that vileness, making folks lie, killing an innocent man, taking his property, violating the law of God in Leviticus. And then we see the sentence. Sentence was death. Death sentence. For Ahab sinned, there won't be one sentence or one punishment. And that was the death penalty. See, this man's guilty of murder, thief. He was a thief. He get deception, idolatry, and every form of wickedness and evil you can think of. He's guilty in the sight of God, and he must die. And Ahab gave himself, his own self, plenty of rope. But I want you to notice one thing. I want you to look with me, if you will, at the end of that chapter. I do want you to look at the end of that chapter. Look in verse 25. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably, abominable that word is used, in following idols, according to all things, as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. But notice what happens in 27. And it came to pass when Ahab heard those words, he rent his clothes, which is a sign of anger or shame or repentance in some cases, and put sackcloth upon his flesh, and fasted and lay in sackcloth, and went softly. And the word of the Lord came unto Elisha the Tishbite, saying, Seest thou how Ahab did what? Humbled himself before me. Because he humbled himself before me, I will not bring evil in his days, but in his son's days I will bring evil upon his house. So, even despite the fact he puts a man to death unjustly, we see that God even has mercy at that point on him. Nowhere do we mention that Elijah went out there and killed him in Naboth's vineyard. Didn't happen. See, not there, not at that time. But the sentence is a death sentence. You see? Sometimes we give ourselves just enough rope to hang our own selves sometimes. There was a certain man who wanted to sell his house, and this example just so happens to be in Haiti. I didn't choose it for any particular purpose since what happened to Haiti, but nonetheless I thought it was a good example to illustrate what we're talking about. Sometimes we can let just enough of the devil in. It's the little foxes that spoil the vine. Since we're talking about vineyards. It's those little foxes. But we see a certain man wanted to sell his house in Haiti for $2,000. Another man wanted to buy it because he was poor and he couldn't afford the full price. But after much bargaining, the owner agreed to sell the house for half of its original price, for $1,000, with the stipulation that he would retain the ownership of one nail protruding from just over the door. After several years, the owner wanted the house back. But the new owner was unwilling to sell. He said, "This is my house. You sold it to me." He says, "Yes, but I still own that nail right there." $1,000 nail, wasn't it? So the first owner went out, found the carcass of a dead dog, and hung it from a single nail that he still owned. Soon the house became his again. He couldn't live in it. He stuck that dog on that one nail. That was his nail. He owned it. It was right in the contract. Bottom line is, the moral of it is, if we give the devil one small peg of our life, he's going to hang garbage all over it. That's exactly what happened in that example. So God's mission was declared. Number two, and as we're wrapping up, God's message was delivered. You see, there was a challenge here because when the two men first met, meaning Ahab and Elijah, the first to speak is Ahab. And he sees Elijah approaches him, and he calls him his enemy. See, it had been a long time since these two had seen each other, and they had no lost love between them, I'm sure. But when Ahab looked at Elijah as an enemy, Elijah was in fact the best friend that Ahab had. You see? Because Ahab tried his best to teach Ahab the proper way to live his life. He tried repeatedly to point him in the right direction. And it just so happens that God chose Ahab again. chose Elijah again there to try to point him in the right direction. So we see here that, Ahab might have done a lot better had Jezebel been out to sing. But anyhow, that's a whole other lesson. So we see that challenge there.